Confessions of an Advertising Man by David Ogilvy. As a child, I lived in Lewis Carroll's house in Guildford. My father, whom I adored, was a Gaelic-speaking Highlander, a classical scholar, and a bigoted agnostic. One day he discovered that I had started going to church secretly. My dear old son, how can you swallow that mumbo-jumbo? It is all very well for servants, but not for educated people. You don't have to be a Christian to behave like a gentleman. My mother was a beautiful and eccentric Irishwoman. She disinherited me on the ground that I was likely to acquire more money than was good for me, without any help from her. I could not disagree. At the age of 9, I was sent to board at an aristocratic Dotheboys Hall in Eastbourne. The headmaster wrote of me, "He has a distinctly original mind, inclined to argue with his teachers, and to try and convince them that he is right and the books are wrong, but this perhaps is further proof of his originality." When I suggested that Napoleon might have been a Dutchman because his brother was King of Holland, the headmaster's wife sent me to bed without supper. When she was robbing me for the part of the abbess in the Comedy of Errors, I rehearsed my opening speech with an emphasis that she disliked, whereupon she seized me by the cheek and threw me to the floor. At the age of 13, I went to Fettes, a Scottish school whose Spartan disciplines had been established by my great-uncle, Lord Justice General Inglis, the greatest Scottish advocate of all time. My friends at this splendid school included Ian MacLeod, Niall Macpherson, Knox Cunningham, and several other future members of Parliament. Chief among the masters I remember Henry Havergal, who inspired me to play the double bass, and Walter Seller, who wrote 1066 and all that while teaching me history. I made a botch of Oxford. Keith Filing, the historian, had given me a scholarship at Christ Church, and I was the recipient of much kindness from Patrick Gordon Walker, Roy Harrod, A.S. Russell, and other dons. But I was too preoccupied to do any work, and was duly expelled. That was in 1931, the bottom of the Depression. For the next 17 years, while my friends were establishing themselves as doctors, lawyers, civil servants, and politicians, I adventured about the world, uncertain of purpose. I was a chef in Paris, a door-to-door salesman, a social worker in the Edinburgh slums, an associate of Dr. Gallup in research for the motion picture industry, an assistant to Sir William Stevenson in British security coordination, and a farmer in Pennsylvania. My boyhood hero had been Lloyd George, and I had expected to become Prime Minister when I grew up. Instead, I finally became an advertising agent on Madison Avenue. The revenues of my 19 clients are now greater than the revenue of Her Majesty's government. Max Beerbohm once told S.N. Berman, "If I was endowed with wealth, I should start a great advertising campaign in all the principal newspapers." The advertisements would consist of one short sentence printed in huge block letters, a sentence that I once heard spoken by a husband to a wife. "My dear, nothing in this world is worth buying." My position is the opposite. I want to buy almost everything I see advertised. My father used to say of a product that it was very well spoken of in the advertisements. I spend my life speaking well of products in advertisements. I hope that you get as much pleasure out of buying them as I get out of advertising them. By writing this book in the old-fashioned first-person singular, I have committed an offense against a convention of contemporary American manners, but I think it artificial to write we when I am confessing my sins and describing my adventures. Chapter 1. How to manage an advertising agency. Managing an advertising agency is like managing any other creative organization. A research laboratory, a magazine, an architect's office, a great kitchen. 30 years ago, I was a chef at the Hotel Majestic in Paris. Henri Soule of the Pavilion tells me that it was probably the best kitchen there has ever been. There were 37 chefs in our brigade. We worked like dervishes 63 hours a week. There was no trade union. From morning to night, we sweated and shouted and cursed and cooked. Every man Jack was inspired by one ambition, to cook better than any chef had ever cooked before. Our esprit de corps would have done credit to the Marines. I have always believed that if I could understand how Monsieur Pitard, the head chef, inspired such white-hot morale, I could apply the same kind of leadership to the management of my advertising agency. To begin with, he was the best cook in the whole brigade, and we knew it. He had to spend most of his time at his desk, planning menus, scrutinizing bills, and ordering supplies, but once a week he would emerge from his glass-walled office in the middle of the kitchen and actually cook something. A crowd of us always gathered around to watch, spellbound by his virtuosity. It was inspiring to work for a supreme master. Following Chef Petard's example, I still write occasional advertisements myself, to remind my brigade of copywriters that my hand has not lost its cunning. Monsieur Petard ruled with a rod of iron, and we were terrified of him. There he sat in his glass cage, the gros bonnet, the arch symbol of authority. Whenever I made a mistake in my work, I would look up to see if his gimlet eye had noticed it. Cooks, like copywriters, work under ferocious pressures and are apt to be quarrelsome. I doubt whether a more easygoing boss could have prevented our rivalries from breaking into violence. Monsieur Bourguignon, our chef saucier, told me that by the time a cook is 40, he is either dead or crazy. I understood what he meant the night our chef potager threw 47 raw eggs across the kitchen at my head, scoring 9 direct hits. His patience had been exhausted by my raids on his stock pot in search of bones for the poodles of an important client. Our chef pâtissier was equally eccentric. Every night he left the kitchen with a chicken concealed in the crown of his Homburg hat. When he went on vacation, he made me stuff 24 peaches into the legs of his long underwear. But when the King and Queen of England were given a state dinner at Versailles, this roguish genius was chosen from all the pâtissiers in France to prepare the ornamental baskets of sugar and the petits fours glacés. Monsieur Petard praised very seldom, but when he did, we were exalted to the skies. When the President of France came to a banquet at the Majestic, the atmosphere in our kitchen was electric. On one of these memorable occasions, I was covering frogs' legs with a white chaud-froid sauce, decorating each little thigh with an ornate leaf of chervil. Suddenly, I became aware that Monsieur Petard was standing beside me, watching. I was so frightened that my knees knocked together and my hands trembled. He took the pencil from his starched toque and waved it in the air, his signal for the whole brigade to gather. Then he pointed at my frog's legs and said very slowly and very quietly, "That's how to do it." I was his slave for life. Today, I praise my staff as rarely as Petard praised his chefs, in the hope that they too will appreciate it more than a steady gush of appreciation. Monsieur Petard gave us all a great sense of occasion. One evening when I had prepared a soufflé Rothschild with 3 liqueurs, he took me upstairs to the door of the dining room and allowed me to watch President Paul Doumer eat it. 3 weeks later, on May 7, 1932, Doumer was dead. Not from my soufflé, but from the bullet of a mad Russian. Monsieur Petard did not tolerate incompetence. He knew that it is demoralizing for professionals to work alongside incompetent amateurs. I saw him fire 3 pastry cooks in a month for the same crime. They could not make the caps on their brioches rise evenly. Mr. Gladstone would have applauded such ruthlessness. He held that the first essential for a prime minister is to be a good butcher. Monsieur Petard taught me exorbitant standards of service. For example, he once heard me tell a waiter that we were fresh out of the plat du jour, and almost fired me for it. In a great kitchen, he said, one must always honor what one has promised on the menu. I pointed out that the dish in question would take so long to cook that no client would wait for a new batch to be prepared. Was it our famous colibiac de saumon, a complicated kedgeree made with the spine marrow of sturgeon, semolina cacio, salmon collops, mushrooms, onions, and rice, rolled up in a brioche paste and baked for 50 minutes? Or was it our still more exotic Caroli eclairs, stuffed with a puree of woodcock's entrails cooked in champagne, covered with a brown chaud-froid sauce and masked with game jelly? At this distance of time I do not remember, but I remember exactly what Petard said to me. "Next time you see that we are running out of a plat du jour, come and tell me. I will then get on the telephone to other hotels and restaurants until I find one which has the same dish on its menu. Then I will send you in a taxi to bring back a supply. Never again tell a waiter that we are fresh out of anything." Today I see red when anybody at Ogilvy, Benson & Mather tells a client that we cannot produce an advertisement or a television commercial on the day we have promised it. In the best establishments, promises are always kept, whatever it may cost in agony and overtime. Soon after I joined Monsieur Petard's brigade, I was faced with a problem in morality for which neither my father nor my schoolmasters had prepared me. The chef garde-manger sent me to the chef saucier with some raw sweetbreads which smelled so putrid that I knew they would endanger the life of any client who ate them. The sauce would mask their condition, and the client would eat them. I protested to the chef garde-manger, but he told me to carry out his order. He knew that he would be in hot water if Monsieur Petard discovered that he had run out of fresh sweetbreads. What was I to do? I had been brought up to believe that it is dishonorable to inform, but I did just that. I took the putrid sweetbreads to Monsieur Petard and invited him to smell them. Without a word to me, he went over to the chef garde-manger and fired him. The poor bastard had to leave then and there. In Down and Out in Paris and London, George Orwell told the world that French kitchens are dirty. He had never worked at the Majestic. Monsieur Petard was a martinet in making us keep the kitchen clean. Twice a day I had to scrape the wooden surface of the larder table with a sharp plane. Twice a day the floor was scrubbed and clean sawdust put down. Once a week a bug catcher scoured the kitchen in search of roaches. We were issued clean uniforms every morning. Today I am a martinet in making my staff keep their offices shipshape. A messy office creates an atmosphere of sloppiness and leads to the disappearance of secret papers. We cooks were badly paid, but Monsieur Petard made so much from the commissions which his suppliers paid him that he could afford to live in a chateau. Far from concealing his wealth from the rest of us, he drove to work in a taxi, carried a cane with a gold head, and dressed when off duty like an international banker. This flaunting of privilege stimulated our ambition to follow in his footsteps. The immortal Auguste Escoffier had the same idea. When he was chef de cuisine at the Carlton in London before the First World War, he used to drive to the Derby on the box of a coach and four, dressed in a gray frock coat and top hat. Among my fellow cooks at the Majestic, Escoffier's guide culinaire was still the definitive authority, the court of last appeal in all our arguments about recipes. Just before he died, he emerged from retirement and came to luncheon in our kitchen. It was like Brahms lunching with the musicians of the Philharmonic. During the service of luncheon and dinner, Monsieur Petard stationed himself at the counter, where we cooks handed our dishes to the waiters. He inspected every single dish before it left the kitchen. Sometimes he sent it back to the cook for more work. Always he reminded us not to put too much on the plate. Pas trop. He wanted the Majestic to make a profit. Today I inspect every campaign before it goes to the client, and send back many of them for more work, and I share Monsieur Petard's passion for profit. Perhaps the ingredient in Monsieur Petard's leadership which made the most profound impression on me was his industry. I found my 63 hours bending over a red-hot stove so exhausting that I had to spend my day off lying on my back in a meadow looking at the sky. But Petard worked 77 hours a week and took only one free day a fortnight. That is about my schedule today. I figure that my staff will be less reluctant to work overtime if I work longer hours than they do. An executive who recently left my agency wrote in his farewell letter, "You set the pace on doing homework. It is a disconcerting experience to spend a Saturday evening in the garden next door to your house, carousing for 4 hours while you sit, unmoving at your desk by the window doing your homework. The word gets around." I learned something else at the Majestic. If you can make yourself indispensable to a client, you will never be fired. Our most important client, an American lady who occupied a suite of 7 rooms, subjected herself to a diet which was based on a baked apple at every meal. One day she threatened to move to the Ritz unless her apple was always burst. I developed a technique of baking 2 apples, passing their flesh through a sieve to remove all traces of core, and then replacing the flesh of both apples in one skin. The result was the most voluptuous baked apple our client had ever seen, and more calories than she ever suspected. Word came down to the kitchen that the chef who was baking those apples must be given tenure. My closest friend was an elderly Argentier who bore a striking resemblance to the late Charles C. Burlingham. His most cherished memory was a vision of Edward VII, Edward the Caresser, floating majestically across the sidewalk to his brougham after 2 magnums of Entente Cordiale at Maxim's. My friend was a communist. Nobody cared about that. They were far more impressed by my own nationality. A Scotsman in a French kitchen is as rare as a Scotsman on Madison Avenue. My fellow chefs who had heard tales of my ancestral highlands christened me Sauvage. I became still more savage when I arrived on Madison Avenue. Managing an advertising agency isn't all beer and Skittles. After 14 years of it, I have come to the conclusion that the top man has one principal responsibility: to provide an atmosphere in which creative mavericks can do useful work. Dr. William Menninger has described the difficulties with uncanny insight. In the advertising industry, to be successful, you must, of necessity, accumulate a group of creative people. This probably means a fairly high percentage of high-strung, brilliant, eccentric nonconformists. Like most doctors, you are on call day and night, 7 days a week. This constant pressure on every advertising executive must take a considerable physical and psychological toll. The pressure that the executive places on the account executive, on the supervisor, and they in turn on the creative people. Then most of all, the client's pressures on them and on you. A special problem with the employees of an advertising agency is that each one watches the other one very carefully, to see if one gets a carpet before the other, to see if one has an assistant before the other, or to see if one makes an extra nickel before the other. It isn't that they want the carpet or the assistant or the nickel, so much as it is the recognition of their standing with father. The executive is inevitably a father figure. To be a good father, whether it is to his children or to his associates, requires that he be understanding, that he be considerate, and that he be human enough to be affectionate. In the early days of our agency, I worked cheek by jowl with every employee. Communication and affection were easy. But as our brigade grows bigger, I find it more difficult. How can I be a father figure to people who don't even know me by sight? My agency now employs 497 men and women. I have discovered that they have an average of 100 friends each, a total of 49,700 friends. If I tell all my staff what we are doing in the agency, what we believe in, what our ambitions are, they will tell their 49,700 friends. And this will give us 49,700 rooters for Ogilvy, Benson, and Mather. So once a year, I assemble the whole brigade in the auditorium of the Museum of Modern Art and give them a candid report on our operations, profits, and all. Then I tell them what kind of behavior I admire in these terms. 1. I admire people who work hard, who bite the bullet. I dislike passengers who don't pull their weight in the boat. It is more fun to be overworked than to be underworked. There is an economic factor built into hard work. The harder you work, the fewer employees we need, and the more profit we make. The more profit we make, the more money becomes available for all of us. 2. I admire people with first-class brains, because you cannot run a great advertising agency without brainy people. But brains are not enough unless they are combined with intellectual honesty. 3. I have an inviolable rule against employing nepots and spouses because they breed politics. Whenever 2 of our people get married, one of them must depart, preferably the female to look after her baby. 4. I admire people who work with gusto. If you don't enjoy what you are doing, I beg you to find another job. Remember the Scottish proverb, "Be happy while you're living, for you're a long time dead." 5. I despise toadies who suck up to their bosses. They are generally the same people who bully their subordinates. 6. I admire self-confident professionals, the craftsmen who do their jobs with superlative excellence. They always seem to respect the expertise of their colleagues. They don't poach. 7. I admire people who hire subordinates who are good enough to succeed them. I pity people who are so insecure that they feel compelled to hire inferiors as their subordinates. 8. I admire people who build up their subordinates, because this is the only way we can promote from within the ranks. I detest having to go outside to fill important jobs, and I look forward to the day when that will never be necessary. 9. I admire people with gentle manners who treat other people as human beings. I abhor quarrelsome people. I abhor people who wage paper warfare. The best way to keep the peace is to be candid. Remember, Blake, I was angry with my friend. I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe. I told it not, my wrath did grow. 10. I admire well-organized people who deliver their work on time. The Duke of Wellington never went home until he had finished all the work on his desk. Having told my staff what I expect of them, I then tell them what I expect of myself. 1. I try to be fair and to be firm, to make unpopular decisions without cowardice, to create an atmosphere of stability, and to listen more than I talk. 2. I try to sustain the momentum of the agency, its ferment, its vitality, its forward thrust. 3. I try to build the agency by landing new accounts. At this point, the upturned faces in my audience look like baby birds waiting for the father bird to feed them. 4. I try to win the confidence of our clients at their highest level. 5. I try to make sufficient profits to keep you all from penury and old age. 6. I plan our policies far into the future. 7. I try to recruit people of the highest quality at all levels, to build the hottest staff in the agency business. 8. I try to get the best out of every man and woman in the agency. Running an agency takes vitality and sufficient resilience to pick oneself up after defeats, affection for one's henchmen, and tolerance for their foibles, a genius for composing sibling rivalries, an unerring eye for the main chance, and morality. People who work in advertising agencies can suffer serious blows to their esprit de corps if they catch their leader in acts of unprincipled opportunism. Above all, the head of an agency must know how to delegate. This is easier said than done. The clients don't like the management of their accounts to be delegated to juniors, any more than patients in hospitals like the doctors to turn them over to medical students. In my opinion, delegation has been carried too far in some of the big agencies. Their top men have withdrawn into administration, leaving all contact with clients to juniors. This process builds large agencies, but it leads to mediocrity and performance. I have no ambition to preside over a vast bureaucracy. That is why we have only 19 clients. The pursuit of excellence is less profitable than the pursuit of bigness, but it can be more satisfying. The act of delegation often results in interposing a foreman between the agency boss and his staff. When this happens, the employees feel like children whose mother turns them over to the tender mercies of a nanny. But they become reconciled to the separation when they discover that the nannies are more patient, more accessible, and more expert than I am. My success or failure as the head of an agency depends more than anything else on my ability to find people who can create great campaigns, men with fire in their bellies. Creativity has become the subject of formal study by psychologists. If they can identify the characteristics of creative individuals, they can put into my hands a psychometric test for selecting young people who can be taught to become great campaign builders. Dr. Frank Barron at the University of California's Institute of Personality Assessment has done promising research in this direction. His conclusions fit my own observations. Creative people are especially observant, and they value accurate observation, telling themselves the truth, more than other people do. They often express part truths, but this they do vividly. The part they express is the generally unrecognized. By displacement of accent and apparent disproportion in statement, they seek to point to the usually unobserved. They see things as others do, but also as others do not. They are born with greater brain capacity. They have more ability to hold many ideas at once and to compare more ideas with one another, hence to make a richer synthesis. They are by constitution more vigorous and have available to them an exceptional fund of psychic and physical energy. Their universe is thus more complex, and in addition, they usually lead more complex lives. They have more contact than most people do with the life of the unconscious, with fantasy, reverie, the world of imagination. While I wait for Dr. Barron and his colleagues to synthesize their clinical observations into formal psychometric tests, I have to rely on more old-fashioned and empirical techniques for spotting creative dynamos. Whenever I see a remarkable advertisement or television commercial, I find out who wrote it. Then I call the writer on the telephone and congratulate him on his work. A poll has shown that creative people would rather work at Ogilvy, Benson, and Mather than at any other agency, so my telephone call often produces an application for a job. I then ask the candidate to send me the 6 best advertisements and commercials he has ever written. This reveals, among other things, whether he can recognize a good advertisement when he sees one, or is only the instrument of an able supervisor. Sometimes I call on my victim at home. 10 minutes after crossing the threshold, I can tell whether he has a richly furnished mind, what kind of taste he has, and whether he is happy enough to sustain pressure. We receive hundreds of job applications every year. I am particularly interested in those which come from the Middle West. I would rather hire an ambitious young man from Des Moines than a high-priced fugitive from a fashionable agency on Madison Avenue. When I observe these grandees, coldly correct and critically dull, I am reminded of Roy Campbell's On Some South African Novelists. You praise the firm restraint with which they write. I'm with you there, of course. They use the snaffle and the curb all right. But where's the bloody horse? I pay special attention to applications from Western Europe. Some of our best writers are Europeans. They are well educated, they work hard, they are less conventional, and they are more objective in their approach to the American consumer. Advertising is a business of words, but advertising agencies are infested with men and women who cannot write. They cannot write advertisements, and they cannot write plans. They are as helpless as deaf mutes on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera. It is sad that the majority of men who are responsible for advertising today, both the agents and the clients, are so conventional. The business community wants remarkable advertising but turns a cold shoulder to the kind of people who can produce it. That is why most advertisements are so infernally dull. Albert Lasker made $50 million out of advertising, partly because he could stomach the atrocious manners of his great copywriters. John E. Kennedy, Claude C. Hopkins, and Frank Hummert. Some of the mammoth agencies are now being managed by second-generation caretakers who floated to the top of their organizations because they were smooth contact men. But courtiers cannot create potent campaigns. The sad truth is that despite the sophisticated apparatus of the modern agency, advertising isn't getting the results it used to get in the crude days of Lasker and Hopkins. Our business needs massive transfusions of talent. And talent, I believe, is most likely to be found among nonconformists, dissenters, and rebels. Not long ago, the University of Chicago invited me to participate in a seminar on the creative organization. Most of the other participants were learned professors of psychology who make it their business to study what they call creativity. Feeling like a pregnant woman at a convention of obstetricians, I told them what I have learned about the creative process from my experience as the chief of 73 writers and artists. The creative process requires more than reason. Most original thinking isn't even verbal. It requires a groping experimentation with ideas, governed by intuitive hunches and inspired by the unconscious. The majority of businessmen are incapable of original thinking because they are unable to escape from the tyranny of reason. Their imaginations are blocked. I am almost incapable of logical thought, but I have developed techniques for keeping open the telephone line to my unconscious in case that disorderly repository has anything to tell me. I hear a great deal of music. I am on friendly terms with John Barleycorn. I take long, hot baths. I garden. I go into retreat among the Amish. I watch birds. I go for long walks in the country. And I take frequent vacations so that my brain can lie fallow. No golf, no cocktail parties, no tennis, no bridge, no concentration, only a bicycle. While thus employed in doing nothing, I receive a constant stream of telegrams from my unconscious, and these become the raw material for my advertisements. But more is required. Hard work, an open mind, and ungovernable curiosity. Many of the greatest creations of man have been inspired by the desire to make money. When George Frederick Handel was on his beam ends, he shut himself up for 21 days and emerged with the complete score of Messiah and hit the jackpot. Few of the themes of Messiah were original. Handel dredged them up from his unconscious, where they had been stored since he heard them in other composers' work, or since he had composed them for his own forgotten operas. At the end of a concert at Carnegie Hall, Walter Damrosch asked Rachmaninoff what sublime thoughts had passed through his head as he stared out into the audience during the playing of his concerto. "I was counting the house," said Rachmaninoff. "If Oxford undergraduates were paid for their work, I would have performed miracles of scholarship and become Regius Professor of Modern History. It wasn't until I tasted lucre on Madison Avenue that I began to work in earnest." In the modern world of business, it is useless to be a creative, original thinker unless you can also sell what you create. Management cannot be expected to recognize a good idea unless it is presented to them by a good salesman. In my 14 years on Madison Avenue, I have had only one great idea which I was unable to sell. I wanted International Paper to dedicate their 26 million acres of woodlands to the public for camping, fishing, hunting, hiking, and birdwatching. I suggested that this sublime gesture would rank with Carnegie's libraries and Rockefeller's foundation as an act of historic munificence. It is a good idea, but hailed to sell it. Finally, I have observed that no creative organization, whether it is a research laboratory, a magazine, a Paris kitchen, or an advertising agency, will produce a great body of work unless it is led by a formidable individual. The Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge was great because of Lord Rutherford. The New Yorker was great because of Ross. The Majestic was great because of Pitard. It isn't everybody who enjoys working in the atelier of a master. The implication of dependence gnaws at their vitals until they conclude, to reign is worth ambition, though, in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. So they leave my atelier only to discover that their paradise is lost. A few weeks after one of these poor fellows departed, he wrote, "When I left your agency, I was prepared to feel some sadness. What I felt was distress. I have never been so bereft in all my life. This, I suppose, is the price one has to pay for the privilege of having belonged to an elite. There are so few of them around. When a good man quits, his cronies wonder why, and generally suspect that he has been mistreated by management. Recently, I have found a way to prevent this misunderstanding. When my young copy chief resigned to become vice chairman of another agency, he and I exchanged letters in the style of a cabinet minister resigning to a prime minister, and they were printed in our staff magazine. The dear defector wrote to me, 'You must accept the blame for what I am as an advertising man. You invented me and have taught me how much I do not know. You once said that you should have charged me tuition all these years, and it's true.' I replied in kind, 'It has been a grand experience to watch you grow in 11 short years from cub writer to copy chief. You have become one of our best campaign builders. You work hard and you work fast. Your vitality and resilience make it possible for you to remain calm and cheerful, contagiously cheerful, through all the tribulations which buffet copy chiefs. Few of the great creators have bland personalities. They are cantankerous egotists, the kind of men who are unwelcome in the modern corporation. Consider Winston Churchill. He drank like a fish. He was capricious and willful. When opposed, he sulked. He was rude to fools. He was wildly extravagant. He wept on the slightest provocation. His conversation was Rabelaisian. He was inconsiderate to his staff. Yet Lord Alanbrooke, his chief of staff, could write, 'I shall always look back on the years I worked with him as some of the most difficult and trying ones in my life. For all that, I thank God that I was given the opportunity of working alongside of such a man, and of having my eyes open to the fact that occasionally such supermen exist on this earth.' That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check our link in the description, where you'll find many other fundamental advertising books in different languages. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more persuasion and marketing-related content. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next video.